Welcome to lecture number 105. This is the last lecture of the 9th historical period, which means it's the last lecture of the course. The historical topic is 9.7, Causation in Period 9. The learning objective is explain the relative significance of the effects of change in the period after 1980 on American national identity. The first key concept covers the conservative movement. A newly ascended conservative movement achieved several political and policy goals during the 1980s, and continued to strongly influence public discourse in the following decades. One main cause for the conservative movement was the 1964 presidential campaign of Barry Goldwater. His conservative political ideology influences younger conservatives at the time like Ronald Reagan, who will win the White House in 1980. All of the troubles of the 70s like stagflation, Watergate, the pardoning of Nixon, and the Iran hostage crisis leads American voters to be skeptical of bigger government. So they vote for someone who promises them less government, like Ronald Reagan. Reagan's victory leads to a reduction in tax cuts and domestic spending that had been such a big part of the Great Society of the 1960s. Social conservatism also grows in conjunction to this. Social conservatives opposed gay marriage and abortion. Reagan's election could not have happened without the conversion of the blue-collar Democrats, who had once been a key part of the New Deal coalition. The next key concept says conservative beliefs regarding the need for traditional social values and a reduced role for the government advanced in U.S. politics after 1980. The presidents that were in office in the 1970s and 1980s are really important for the makeup of the Supreme Court. From 1968 to 1992, the only Democratic president was Jimmy Carter, and he didn't get a chance to appoint any Supreme Court's justices, which means that the conservative justices make up a majority of the Supreme Court. This more conservative court starts to put limits on abortion in the court case Planned Parenthood versus Casey. They limit affirmative action programs and strengthen gun rights in D.C. versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago in 2010. Conservatives in the executive branch and the judicial branch led to a reduced role of government. As a result of the laws that Reagan passed, there's also deregulation of businesses and also a reduction in welfare benefits like Medicaid. The next key concept says, moving into the 21st century, the nation experienced significant technological, economic, and demographic changes. The technological changes came in the form of the internet, smartphones, and social media. New technology generally has been a positive effect on economic growth. In the 1990s, the dot-com boom exemplified this growth, even though it later turned out to be a dot-com bust. There was also a decline of manufacturing jobs, and that leads to a growth of the service sector jobs. This disparity between the people who are able to work in white-collar jobs and service sector jobs leads to a growing wealth gap. The Great Recession, which happened in 2008 as a result of the subprime mortgage crisis, and the pandemic recession in 2020, hurt these economic groups disproportionately. The people who are already wealthy are not going to hurt as much, meanwhile people who are working in service sector jobs make much less money and can save less, even though they might be working the same amount of hours. So if they already are living very close to the poverty line, one missed paycheck or being laid off is more detrimental to those lower income groups. Demographic changes and international migration happened as a result of the 1965 Immigration Act. Immigration rebounded as a result of the act, and the current percent of the U.S. population that is foreign-born is just about 16 to 17%. However, immigration levels will not rise to the pre-1920s levels again. The next key concept says new developments in science and technology enhance the economy and transform society while manufacturing decreased. Technological developments in science and technology enhance the economy and transform society while manufacturing decreases. Companies like Google, Apple, and others based in Silicon Valley lead the way in these new economic sectors. These jobs are usually white-collar jobs. Meanwhile, blue-collar jobs in manufacturing decrease to outside competition and some free trade agreements. These allow companies to send their manufacturing operations abroad where the labor costs are much lower. The U.S. economy thus shifts to tertiary and quaternary economic activity. These are service industry and information industry jobs. Higher-paying white-collar jobs require a higher level of education, which contributes to the growing wealth gap. Not everyone is able to pay for a 4-year college education or is willing to put themselves into large amounts of debt to pay for those 4 years of college. The next key concept says the U.S. population continued to undergo demographic shifts that had significant cultural and political consequences. The South and the West of the U.S. experienced internal migration because of lower taxes, a friendly business environment, and warmer climate. The increased population in those southern and western states caused an increased significance in elections. In the 2000 presidential election, the state of Florida was the key to the victory of George W. Bush. There was a difference of less than 600 votes between him and Al Gore in that race. International migration increased the amount of people coming from outside the United States, and it leads to cultural blending, a rise of new foods, languages spoken, and the practice of Roman Catholicism. A lot of international migrants are from Latin American countries where Catholicism is the main religion. There's also a rise of illegal immigration. The attempt for the federal government to curb illegal immigration in this period was the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. It shifted the burden of enforcement to private businesses to make sure that they're not hiring undocumented workers. It's not effective because the number of undocumented migrants continued to rise from the 1980s to the present day. The next key concept says, the end of the Cold War and new challenges to U.S. leadership forced the nation to redefine its foreign policy and the role in the world. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved, and the U.S. had to begin dismantling all of the weapons that they had built up throughout the entirety of the Cold War. The U.S. and Russia signed the START treaties to renew their relationship without the threat of warfare. It should be pointed out that no other treaties on arms reductions between the U.S. and Russia have been negotiated or signed since then in 1993. The U.S. leads the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq after the 9/11 attacks. It impacts the place of America in the world because U.S. allies grow weary of American intervention abroad. The case of Iraq stands out because the U.S. didn't get the approval of the UN Security Council prior to the invasion. Despite that, the U.S. will still engage in efforts on global cooperation. The United States keeps its leadership positions in the international organizations like the UN, NATO, and also the G8, which is made up of the leaders of the countries with the 8th largest economies. They come together once a year to talk about the issues that they foresee as being the biggest challenges moving forward. However, after 2014, Russia's membership was suspended over their annexation of Crimea, so they have been the G7 for nearly the last 10 years. The second to last key concept says, the Reagan administration promoted an interventionist foreign policy that continued in later administrations, even after the end of the Cold War. The threat of the spread of communism didn't go away during the Reagan administration. This fear was the cause for the United States to contain pro-communist governments in the Western Hemisphere and to prop up pro-US governments in Latin and South America, even if those anti-communist governments were undemocratic or authoritarian. The US overthrew a military dictator in the Caribbean island of Grenada, who had received aid from Cuba and the Soviet Union to carry out a coup d'etat. The US also aided the Contras in Nicaragua and later used the proceeds from arms sales to Iran to fund the Contras to fight against the Marxist Sandinistas. Finally, George H.W. Bush continued this interventionist policy to stop Iraq from invading neighboring Kuwait in 1990. Operation Desert Storm was successful in removing Iraqi troops from Kuwait, but Hussein was left in power. In 2003's Iraq invasion, George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, removed Hussein from power and implemented a new government. The final key concept says, following the attacks of September 11, 2001, U.S. foreign policy efforts focused on fighting terrorism around the world. The 9/11 attacks led to a war on terror. The United States had experienced terrorist attacks around the world prior to 9/11. For example, in 1998, there were coordinated attacks on U.S. embassies across East African capitals. There were instances of domestic terrorist attacks as well, like the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. But nothing to the extent of the 9/11 attacks. If anything, the 9/11 attacks were so much more visually striking because of the Twin Towers that came down as a result of the attack. Thus, fighting terrorism became the new U.S. priority. The U.S. began by overthrowing the Taliban in Afghanistan, who had been harboring Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The Bush administration also alleged that Saddam Hussein in Iraq had ties to terrorism and had weapons of mass destruction to give to those terrorist groups. That leads to another invasion and another effort to implement a new government in the Middle Eastern country. The unrest and power vacuum from the Arab Spring and the U.S. invasions led to the growth of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. The civil war that was going on in Syria against the authoritarian president and the weak government in Iraq allowed this terrorist group to take control of certain towns in Syria. It resulted in renewed U.S. intervention in the region to defeat ISIS. Finally, the recap of the last lecture of the course, the conservative movement came to power in 1980 with Reagan's election, and conservatives generally wanted government's roles to decrease. Technological changes impacted the economy, and demographic changes impacted culture and politics. The U.S. continued to be deeply involved in other countries as part of its Cold War policy and beyond. The U.S. had to find a new purpose in its foreign policy after the Cold War ended. And finally, the war on terror became a new foreign policy objective after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. Alright, thank you so much for watching these videos. I hope that they've been helpful in your studying for the AP exam. I wish you the very best of luck. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit APUSHslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.